Someone who observes how Purim is celebrated would be forgiven if he found it a little odd. People dress up in costumes and people engage in all sorts of happy and sometimes frivolous activities. And when you look at the book of Esther, you discover that the divine name is totally absent, as it is from the Song of Songs, but it's only 2 out of all the books in the Bible, which should be understood. And the book is called Megillah, even though there are other 4 books which have that signification, but the title, The Megillah, is the book of Esther. And some people have a custom of eating krepach, which is dough filled on the inside with meat. Why would there be such a custom on Purim? What does it have to do with Purim? There are many elements of Purim which are, on the surface, mysterious. Purim has one deep message. If you look at the events in the book of Esther, you start with events that seem to be normal political intrigue. The king throws a party for 6 months. At the end of another week, he sends for the queen to make an appearance. She refuses because there's a political intrigue between the king and the queen. She's fighting for her own power, her own authority, and the king sees this as a threat. He devises a plan together with his advisors to get rid of her, and she's deposed. If you lived through that, you wouldn't see this as divine providence. You wouldn't see this as a miracle. You would see it as normal political intrigue. There's a beauty contest to pick a substitute queen, and Esther is chosen. Well, somebody had to be chosen. Whoever be chosen would be very improbable that that person would be chosen. Must you see this as some kind of miracle? Some kind of divine providence? Not necessary. There's a plot against the life of the king. And Mordechai overhears the plot and exposes it to Esther, who exposes it to the queen, and the plot is foiled. Well, there are plots against kings all the time. And usually they're foiled because if they weren't, it would hardly pay to be king, because your life would be short. Now, Mordechai isn't rewarded. That's also strange. Wouldn't you think the king would like to reward people who save his life, so as to encourage more people to save his life? But the Jewish people were a despised people. They were conquered and scattered in exile, unlike the other provinces which were ruled by the empire, but they had their own population, they had their own piece of geography. Maybe rewarding Mordechai was just too degrading for the king to consider. None of this looks particularly miraculous. None of it looks particularly an expression of direct divine providence. But then, at the end of the story, we get a different impression altogether. Haman's coming in to tell the king to hang Mordechai. And just that night, the king can't sleep. And he orders the history books to be brought to be read to him because, as everyone knows, history puts you to sleep. And it's open to the passage where Mordechai saved the king's life, and all of a sudden the king's conscience is stirred. Did we do anything to reward Mordechai? No. We have to rectify that. Who's in the courtyard? And Haman's in the courtyard to come in and have Mordechai hung. And the king says, let him come in, and tricks him into doing great honor to Mordechai, quite against his will, quite against his expectation. Now the reader at this point says, wait a minute, that's not natural. That's not normal. That's not probable. That looks utterly artificial. It doesn't look like normal, human, social, political behavior. That's the point of the book. The point of the book that it isn't natural. It isn't normal. It isn't expected. It isn't probable. That's precisely the point. At this point, you see divine providence clearly. And then Queen Esther is there as a Jew to plead on behalf of the Jewish people. That also looks like direct divine providence. Now here's the message. Once you get to the end of the book and you see the divine providence, you go back and look at the original events and realize that they were divine providence also, though they didn't seem to be so at the time when they occurred. For Esther to be queen, she's got to become queen. How did that happen? Well, Vashti got pushed out. Vashti got pushed out because of the feast that Achashverosh made and invited her to make an appearance, and she didn't. And then there was a beauty contest, and Esther won. All of that was background for her to be in the key position of queen to plead on behalf of the Jewish people. Mordechai overheard a plot against the king, and it was foiled. It was recorded, but he wasn't rewarded. All that wasn't just accidental. That was also to put Mordechai in a position where, on the night when Haman comes to kill him, Mordechai can be saved. The message of the Megillah Esther is that events are run by a power that's usually hidden. They aren't what they seem. The message of Purim is, look beneath the surface. Don't be taken in by surface appearances. And then you can understand why, for example, people dress up in costumes. Because don't be taken in when you see that gorilla knocking on your door. It's not a gorilla, it's a yeshiva bacher who wants money for his yeshiva. You have to look beneath the costume to see. What is kreplach? Kreplach looks like matzah balls. But it isn't. Because in the heart of it, it has meat, which you don't see till you cut into it and go beneath the appearances. The name of God isn't in the Megillah because the story of Queen Esther is not a story where God waves the flag and says, here I am. He forces you to look deeper, penetrate, analyze, and see his activity in cases where it's not open and obvious. And the same thing is true with calling it Ha-Megillah. The word Megillah is derived, some say, from the verb liglol, which means to roll up, because their books were scrolls and they were rolled up. But then every book was rolled up, including the other 4 books, which are also called Megillah. The other explanation is that Megillah comes from a verb which means to reveal. The Megillah has the function of revealing what's otherwise hidden. It paints a picture of something which looks purely natural and forces you to look deeper to find the divine providence that's behind the otherwise natural appearance. And that's the message of the Megillah for our day. We also live in a time of great political intrigue and great economic activity and military activity, and people are calculating the forces on this side and the forces on that side. We mustn't forget that ultimately the outcome of all these events, all these interactions, all these tensions, the outcome is something which divine providence provides, which means that we have to learn to look beneath the surface and understand what divine providence wants in all of our lives.